So, Bob, emails. Let's answer them. What do you say?
Let's answer them.
So, the first thing I want to ask you about isn't an email. It is about Teal Swan. I'm doing a series about Teal Swan, who is a religious guru who is getting a lot of fame recently because there was a recent documentary about her on Hulu. And she already was pretty big on YouTube to begin with. But I was curious as to what you thought about Teal Swan.
You sent me YouTube links to two videos that she put out about suicide. One was advice, and the other one was, as far as I could tell, a reaction to the feedback she got about the first video. I didn't get to watch the second one, and I didn't get all the way through the first one.
Well, the reason why I asked you to watch it was because you are an expert on suicidality, having been a teacher of dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, for the past 20 years or something.
Yeah.
You are an expert in helping people to reduce their suicidality. So I was curious as to what you thought about her approach to helping people with suicide.
I didn't think there was anything terrible in it. I didn't care for it. The way she talks, it's sort of with a bit of hubris and sort of like she's the expert and she will help you because, she's the expert. She mentions that she tried to kill herself 4 times, and she sort of holds that out as that means that therefore she must know what everybody else is going through. I don't think that's a good attitude to take towards someone who's suicidal. I know what you're going through. I think that can be really insulting and off-putting. And I think it's probably better to have an attitude of more listening than it is pronouncing. I took a couple of notes, like she calls herself the perfect example. I wouldn't do that because it just invites people to say, no, you're not, and then refute your message. She says suicide is about getting others to see your pain. I actually don't agree with that. I think that the danger there is this attitude that a lot of people have is, see, they're just attention seeking. Actually, I haven't found anybody that's suicidal that was actually attention seeking. And I think this is a concept that gets sort of twisted. People that are suicidal deserve our attention and care. We ought to pay attention and care about them because they are in just the most god-awful place. But that they're seeking attention is a misunderstanding of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is the idea that behavior is a result of the consequences that it produces. And it is indeed possible that suicidal behavior can be reinforced by the response of the people around. So recently, I spoke with some people I know who have a kid who they are afraid is going to kill themselves. And their response to that is to, kowtow and step real lightly, like on eggshells, and not do anything to upset her and not say no to her requests. And their thought is, if we say no, then she'll threaten to kill herself. And then it's really bad. And I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know enough about it. I mean, the sound of things is that has happened. And so they end up just tiptoeing around things and then not holding their limit. And I think one of the potential outcomes for that is to actually increase the other person's suicide. Because, and this operant conditioning, I think we should distinguish it from intention. Conditioning is a thing that happens to the human brain, well, really to all mammal brains, outside of necessarily intentional learning. Being a little bit windy here with my description of things. I know another story about a person who really in tough position with her partner just many years ago, and tumultuous relationship with her partner. And they were in the middle of a fight, and he said, "I'm leaving," like he wanted to leave, like take a time out or whatever. And that just frightened her. And she said, "If you leave, I'm going to, do something. I'm not going to talk about what she wanted to do." And so he stayed. And the consequence of that is the brain learns that, this consequence of keeping you around when I'm in desperation for you, I can achieve that end by the threat. And so what she and I talked about were, you can't do that, right? Because 2 things will happen. One is eventually he'll burn out, and that's not going to do you any good. And the second is you're actually reinforcing this as a mode. Like your body's going to choose it. Your body's going to choose this when you feel that kind of desperation, and you'll find yourself, saying that sort of thing. And all you're doing is increasing the likelihood of premature death. And you don't want that. So we've got to get you to do something different with your pain. And one of the things that she talked about with him was, when you need to leave, I will accept it gracefully. I want you to come back in, some length of time, 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And she still found that excruciating, but tolerable. And what they did as a result of kind of taking that tack was they eliminated that threat from the way their fight goes. And he didn't feel so burned out. And ultimately, the impulse stopped showing up that way. Still showed up, but not as a result of the crisis of the fight. So that's like a description of how operant conditioning can work. But what you don't do is you don't say, oh, you're in pain right now. You must be doing this for attention-seeking purposes. And so therefore I'm going to ignore you because I'm going to then break that cycle. Yeah, no, that's a mistake. If you believe that a person is operantly conditioned to fall into that strategy of threat, then what you want to do is you want to talk about it ahead of time, not in the middle of the crisis. And you want to make a clear plan. So I know another story about a person who had psychosomatic seizure. You ever heard of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So she would have these seizures. And what her therapist, and they were real seizures, except that, when she went and had the EEG afterward, there would be no sign of, the usual aftermath of epilepsy. So in other words, these were psychogenic. What she and her therapist discussed was when the seizure hits, the people in her world, they're going to help her to the ground so that she doesn't injure herself. And they'll shove a pillow under her head so that she doesn't, whack herself too hard, because the seizure is actually really happening. But otherwise, they're going to not attend. And she was on board with this. She didn't want to have these seizures either. It wasn't like it was fun. It wasn't like she said, oh, I got what I wanted. I got your attention. No, she didn't get anything that she wanted out of them. It's just this thing that her body was doing.
Well, it was a desperate act to get like 10% of her needs met, essentially. And if she has a more easy or less consequential path to get more of her needs met, then her body will take that psychogenically.
Yeah, right. Psychogenically, yeah. Like, it's important that we're not saying, oh, this is her conscious intent. It wasn't. It's not like she was faking. And what happened was, as a result of interacting with her in the most minimal way possible when the seizures hit, everybody's on board with this, her partner, her family, her friends, the therapist, me, the seizures actually went away. And it didn't take that long. It took, I think, weeks for them to stop.
How often were the seizures happening prior to that?
I think like 2-3 a week.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. But they stopped. And that was the thing that they did all above board, all like everybody here's on the page. We're doing this because we want to help with this particular behavior. But this whole like, well, you're doing it for attention. I'm not going to, it's just a punishing thing to do. And it's really more about the person who has the attitude of you're just attention seeking than about the person who's in pain, because they feel angry. They feel as though they're forced into a position that they don't want to be in. Yeah, I could understand that. I wouldn't like that either. And they don't have means to deal with it in a way that is effective for both themselves and the person that they care about. Mm-hmm. So all suicide is about getting others to see your pain. No, I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
She recommends postponing. She's like, you can always put it off for an hour or a day. You always have as an option. I actually like that strategy. I think that's a really good strategy. She makes a statement that pain is transient. Yeah, agree. Pain is transient. She makes a statement, though, that, the hospital isn't really a great option. It sort of depends on what you're hoping the hospital will do for you. Like she says, I wrote this down verbatim. Hospitalization is an option if you really feel you can't trust yourself. I would not say that to somebody, because it's sort of like saying, well, do you really feel like you can't trust yourself? And then what you get is the potential for somebody who's in crisis to say, well, I should be trying to trust myself here and not making means of all the resources that are available. There's already a lot of obstacles when a person's in that kind of pain to making use of the resources available to them. I don't think we want to do anything to discourage. The point that I think she wants to make is that the hospital won't solve your problems. No, it won't. It won't solve anybody's problems. What it'll do is provide a place for a person to be until the crisis lifts. And she's like, you get out of the hospital and you're still in the same shape that you're in. Yes, that is true. I got the sense that maybe she had bad therapy, people that were outmatched by her experience, her pain and so forth. But I don't think hospital's a bad idea. It can become operantly conditioned, just like we were talking before. So one of the things that they do, if that's the case, one of the things that they do, at least at Harborview is one of the main hospitals in the Seattle area. They put people on a planned admission thing. Do you know about this?
No.
Oh, yeah, it's interesting. So for folks who frequently use the hospital, find themselves hospitalized because of suicidal impulse, it's like, oh shit, we as a system are actually keeping this person suicidal because they get suicidal and they run to the hospital. They get suicidal and they're here in the hospital. And what it ends up being is this way of avoiding. And I don't like the way I just said that because it sounds like, oh, I know I'm going to avoid my life and I'll go to the hospital. Actually, these people are really in crisis. So what the hospitals do is they say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to plan your admissions. You come here at this with this kind of regular frequency. These are planned. Doesn't have to, you don't have to be in crisis to come, and you have to come even if you're not in crisis. And these admissions are planned and they happen at regular intervals. You got to be in therapy and you got to be doing, everything you can outside of your planned admissions to try to get a hold of the thing. But what we'll do here is we'll make your coming to the hospital not conditional on anything. It's to your body. It's sort of random. It's like, well, I'm not in crisis on this Tuesday, but this is my planned admit day, so I'm going, and I'm there for 2-3 days. So the hospitalizations tend to be shorter, but they are not contingent. And then you're not allowed to go to the hospital in between. And so what happens is the person that's in crisis, they're like, well, okay, I just got to hang on until, next week or 2 weeks from now or whatever it is. And then over time, what they do is they decrease the frequency of the admits. So maybe it was like once a month, and then they titrate it back to once every 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever.
And I'm guessing there's a reduction in suicidal thoughts and intention.
Yeah. I mean, you got to do that combined with good therapy
I'm guessing the reason why they do that, a big reason is that of what you're talking about in terms of conditioning, like with the person with the seizure, if we give the person care, then the psychogenic emergence of the impulse will go away if it was related to the conditioning and not some other factor.
Right. Exactly. If it's related to the conditioning, right? And you'll know. A person will know, well, did the seizure rate go down? Okay, then we're hitting the nail on the head. If it didn't, then obviously there's other factors at play. I wouldn't say what she said. I wouldn't say, if you really can't. I would be clear that this isn't going to solve your problems, but it may be a way to stay safe until the crisis passes. In Washington State, the way it works here is a person can be involuntarily committed for, I think it's 72 hours. Mm-hmm. And then they have a court hearing because civil rights count. And then they go before judge, lawyers, and the whole thing, and they make a determination about safety. And the reason 3 days is because that's often enough time for the crisis to pass. And if it doesn't, then I think they go to, is it 4 days or 5 days or something?
I think it depends on their recommendation.
Yeah. Okay. So, and then they have a hearing again, but the idea is that this is what we're going to do to keep you safe. It's going to be the least restrictive option we can come up with, so that your civil rights are not undermined, because we as a society value that. But we also value keeping our citizens safe. And so we will suspend a person's civil rights.
So you're talking about when someone is involuntarily committed, against their will.
Yeah.
What Teal Swan is talking about is don't go to the hospital when your clinicians recommend it, essentially.
Well, she didn't say anything about clinicians. She didn't talk about, at least the part I heard, she didn't talk about therapists at all. What she said was, if you really can't trust yourself, then okay, go. But I'd like people to just think the hospital is a resource that can help you stay safe until the crisis passes. Usually that's hours to maybe 4 or 5 days. Usually, I mean, it is what it is, but usually it's somewhere in there. And then the impulse passes and your life is still your life, but you don't have that thing that the deck isn't so stacked against, and you can be safe.
Yeah, the safety planning that I use and teach is when someone has an increase in suicidal risk, and I have a whole model of determining the level of risk that is similar to other models. And one of the keys to reducing the risk of actually attempting and completing is monitoring by other people, whether it's at a hospital or even just your family or friends.
Yeah.
It's really hard to attempt when your mom is sitting right next to you watching TV.
Right.
It's really hard to attempt when you're not allowed to be alone, and right. That's really what I do when someone is of imminent risk.
Right.
And if they are able to build this safety plan prior to this event, and the support system, I trust them and I'm in contact with them, I might have even had them in session, then I don't necessarily need for them to go to the hospital because I'm fairly confident that their safety plan in terms of monitoring will work and be less expensive and less weird, because, going to a hospital is kind of an odd experience, especially if you've never done it before. But if you have no support system or no solid monitoring system, then the hospital is the only place. It kind of makes me think, as we talk about it, that we could probably find a less expensive, more warm environment, because I think you just go into the regular psych ward with everyone, right? With the people who are fully psychotic and people who are being fed through a tube because they aren't eating, and, the general population of a psych ward, right? Whereas if you had like some sort of shelter where there was monitoring for sure, but it was just for these sorts of folks, then it would be less expensive. And I don't know, maybe communities have that, but regardless, so I suspect you're right. And the more I do a deep dive on Teal Swan, she clearly had some bad experiences in therapy. She's had one good experience in therapy, which I won't bore you with the details because it'll take too long to explain it all. So people reached out, emailed me and said, "Oh, you got to watch this Teal Swan documentary and talk about it." And it's on Hulu and it's about 3 hours. And I sat down to see if it would be, worth doing an episode about. And I watched the episode and I was like, that it's interesting, but it raises a lot of questions, the documentary, because it didn't really tell you much. And so I started doing more investigation, other podcasts, other documentaries, her own material on YouTube. And it just seems like it's one of the deeper rabbit holes I've ever gone on in this podcast. There's just so much to talk about. So any other things from your notes that you wanted to talk about?
I don't like her attitude. Too aggressively certain. Like she knows. I think presuming that we know is one of the most insulting and undermining things that we can do, especially when somebody's in that kind of crisis. I think an attitude of humility is much more helpful.
Unless you're looking for that kind of certainty, I guess, right?
Yes.
Because she's very popular, and her seminars and advice about suicide is one of the most popular things about her thing. I mean, thousands upon thousands of people watch her, or millions of people watch her videos. Thousands of people show up to her seminars. Hundreds of people show up to her retreats and pay $5,000 a piece for a week or two of, I think a week for a retreat with her. Like, I don't know, it looks like there's 10 or 20 participants in that. And a lot of it has to do with suicide. So it's interesting to think about. And I agree with you. And of course, I would never do that or recommend any helper take an attitude of, I know everything before I even meet you. But clearly something's working for her. Yeah. And the allegations are that her approach to suicide over the number of years is actually increasing some people's risk and has been a factor in causally causing people to complete suicide, because a number of her followers have died from suicide. Wow. Now, on one hand, you're like, whoa. On the other hand, you're like, well, she attracts that population. And so there's a greater number of her followers that are going to die by suicide just because of the people that she's helping.
Right. You could make the same case for DBT. A lot of people enter DBT and some will fall to suicide. Some will kill themselves. You could say, well, DBT must be a factor in causing that. Well, no. But if that's where the population finds itself, then that's where you're going to see the concentration of the thing. And it has, there's a tendency to misinterpret the data. So I don't know.
Yeah. We'd have to do a study, which I'm fairly positive has never been done before. And it would be hard to do because how do you compare? It would kind of be apples to oranges, because because if you took her population of followers and say it's like 700,000 people or something, and you take, okay, well, how many of them have come to her regarding suicidal thoughts? You say, okay, maybe like 100,000. And then you say, okay, of those people, how many of them have died by suicide? and you think, okay, well, maybe, I don't know, 300 or something. Okay, you get a percentage there, 100,000 people, 300, that is 0.3% of the people who come to her die by suicide within a year time span or something like that.
I think it's 0.03.
What did I say?
0.3.
Oh, it's 0.03?
Yeah, 3 out of 100.
Oh, you're right.
Actually, it would be 3 out of 1,000 though. If 300 people and 100,000 population, it'd be 3 out of 1,000, wouldn't it?
Right. Well,
yeah, 3 out of 1,000, 0.003. I mean, we're just kicking around
0.003?
Yeah.
Okay. Either way, it's a percentage.
Right.
that I feel like I'm good at math, but you're better, and I made a mistake, which is unpleasant for me. But what do we compare it to, right? So what population do we grab?
Right.
Do we grab DBT?
Sure.
Do we grab people who go to therapy? Do we grab the general population that doesn't seek help for anyone? What group do we compare it to? It'd be really hard to know, because if you did, whatever group you compared it to, let's say that her rate was higher.
Right.
Does that really mean that, because she has a lot of different levels of her sort of thing, where a lot of people just watch her YouTube videos.
Right.
And then there's a smaller set that come to her things, and then there's a smaller set that even come to her retreat. So how do you really evaluate that?
You can't. It's too many unknown variables.
Yeah. Now, if the rate is very high, compared to a lot of other groups, then you could make some speculations.
Yeah, some speculation.
But the way to really do it would be to take 1,000 people and take 500 and have them, go to Teal however you want to, whether it's just YouTube or whatever. And then another 500 people, and you have them say, go to a therapist, and don't go to Teal. Right. And then you compare the death rate after 3 to 5 years. But of course, that's very expensive and potentially unethical on some level, because you're, as a researcher, telling someone to go to a non-clinician with no license, essentially for treatment of suicide. And so we might not ever know, is the thing. But that doesn't mean we can't comment on it. And we certainly know in our field the things that work with suicide, and we can look at her and say, well, in all likelihood, this is maybe helping, but this isn't. Anyway, so if you feel like watching it further, and when we chat, we can sort of check in on it. But if you're not a fan and you just feel like you're watching someone scratch a chalkboard with their fingernails, then avoid it if you want. I don't want to put you through. I think I texted you something. You did. I was like, hey, you got to watch this. And what did you say?
I said, I watched 15 seconds of each one, and I'm not sure I can choke them down.
Yeah. Well, tell me, why? What was happening inside of you in those moments?
It's the voice. It's that aggressively certain. I mean, the way it read to me was aggressively certain and a little bit smug. And hey, look at me. And
well, if you watch more of her stuff, brace yourself, because some of the things that she says is in line with that. I mean, she literally says in the other video I sent you something like, "No one is better at helping people with suicide than me," something like that.
Yep. Yeah. That's the kind of claim I would have a hard time not gagging on.
I mean, maybe she's good, but to say that she's the best in the whole entire universe is bizarre.
That reminds me, you remember that scene from Napoleon Dynamite?
I remember every scene from Napoleon Dynamite.
I love that movie. It's so good.
Yeah.
So they're watching Uncle Rico's video of him throwing the football.
Yeah.
And Napoleon said, "This is probably the worst video ever made." And Kip's comment is about, like, that could really be known. That could be, you can't really know that, Yeah. Neither one of them is saying it's a good video. They're just saying you can't really know if it's the worst.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or Kip is saying you can't really know.
How would you know that, Napoleon? Yeah.
Yeah. Really funny.
God, that movie.
Anyways, I don't know that it is helpful to people to take that kind of attitude toward them. I just prefer a little more grace and a little more humility. That's just me.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, let's humbly take a break, and when we get back, let's talk some more. What do you say, Bob?
Right on.
All right, we're back from the break. So let's get to an email. Anonymous patron, she says, I matched with a therapist on BetterHelp, and over the course of 3 sessions, she said some things that concern me. Are these red flags? She has mocked me for crying and told me to stop at one point. When I mentioned I think I have ADHD and sexual trauma, she didn't acknowledge it. She interrupts me to tell me that my parents are proud of me and that they love me and that they aren't the ones who hurt me, so they aren't to blame for the pain I feel, even after I explained ways that they've hurt me. When I was in the middle of talking about my parents, she said, girl, you need to go on a date. Are these therapist red flags? Bob, what do you think?
Based on what's written here, yeah.
Yeah.
Should I say more than that? I probably should say a little bit more than that.
If you want. I mean, I don't know if there's much to say, but if you have something to say, yeah, share.
What was the first one?
It was, she mocked me for crying and told me to stop.
Yeah, point. that one, you had me at hello, right? That one, yeah, that was yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a charitable interpretation of what actually happened, because sometimes I'm like, well, if we were there, would we see something different? Right. But it's hard to imagine that being different. I mean, either that or the anonymous patron is very distorted and delusional, which, could be, I can never know, but
yeah, can't know.
Not likely. So yeah, huge red flag. Now, is she helpful regardless, anonymous patron? Because if she is, then, talk with her about it and say, don't do that. I don't like it.
Yeah.
Makes me feel this way.
Even if you decide to discontinue talking to her about it, could be a really useful exercise in maintaining or improving your self-respect.
Yeah. If she's not helpful, then, maybe consider shopping around. Anonymous upper tier patron Nadine from Beirut, which is where my cats were from. Hi, Dr. Kirk and Bob. How would you feel if you got this letter before your last session with a client? I have some thoughts that have been stagnant in my mind since our last session with my therapist. So I skipped ahead. I sort of took excerpts out. So upper tier patron Nadine was about to have her last session and sent this letter. And these are excerpts. One thing I want to bring up is that although I asked you if you liked me towards the end of one of our sessions, we never truly unpacked that, in my opinion. You never answered whether you did or did not like me, and I think that other modalities would appreciate that vulnerability and provide that closure in other ways, if not by answering me directly. Instead, you focused on how interesting it was that this came up towards the end of our session rather than earlier, and I perceived that as blame shifting instead of unpacking. Skipping ahead. While I respect that psychologists have different modalities, I find myself feeling like I was more of a participant in an experimental study instead of a client and a human being. I know that we aren't friends, but I also believe that other modalities can have a more humanistic approach and can still maintain strong boundaries at the same time. I'm not saying that all your clients feel this way, and I'm sure that others do appreciate, which I perceive as your hands-off approach. I hope that you are able to process this with your supervisor, as I understand that me and my demeanor may be a lot for some psychologists, if not all. Bob, what do you think of this letter?
This person is in pain and wants their therapist to see and acknowledge that. What was the first part? My memory.
Of the letter?
Yeah, that you read.
You didn't answer the question as to whether or not you liked me, and you're also kind of off, you're very distant, essentially.
Right. Oh, right. What she said was we didn't use, the therapist said somebody said something about unpacking that. I actually think that that's worth considering, because it might be that to unpack such a thing is to increase vulnerability, and to ask that question from a vulnerable place is likely to bear more fruit than to ask it from a guarded place. That said, I don't know. My first thought was, I think the therapist is misattuned.
Yeah. Well, what do you mean? Like they didn't do their job, or what? What's the reason for that?
I don't know if they didn't do their job, but they didn't go far enough with, maybe they ran out of time. I don't know what happened, but there's more to be done with the question than what's described here.
Yeah.
Like, so like if a client asks me that, I mean, I might just say, yeah. I might say, I want to answer that question, but I want to talk about it a little bit ahead of time and ask you a little bit about, who's asking? What part of you wants to know what's happening for you? That question's really important. But I think that question's really important in all therapy. I think it's important that we love our clients. That doesn't mean we just have to proclaim that, but if we don't, I don't know how that we're going to be helpful. Let's see, what the hell am I saying?
Well, let me ask you, could you see a good therapist, an effective therapist with a sound approach being hands-off and as a policy never answers the question, do you like me, to a client? Could you see someone?
I can't see any utility in not answering that question in the positive.
But what if you don't like the client?
Yeah, that's a pickle.
Yeah. To me, I'll say that it's totally valid for someone, a clinician, to have a policy that they don't answer questions like that.
Really?
Totally. It's not your and my style.
Oh, okay.
And that's not what I would recommend or train people to be like, for sure. But, there are a lot of therapists, CBT people come to mind, for example.
Right. Yeah.
Solution-focused people also, brief therapists, that just as a policy, it's just like, when we get into that kind of conversation, it steers away from what I think is helpful to you. And so I would rather explore why you want to ask that question, what's coming up for you. Or I just don't even want to get into that material because I'm here to teach you skills. I'm here to provide you with a service, and it's not about whether or not I like you or not. Also, I could absolutely see a therapist who approaches their work with their clients hands off and actively dislikes some of their clients, and thus says, well, I can never answer it, because what if I answer it for one client and they talk about it on Facebook, and then another client asks me and I say I can't answer? Well, the implication is that I don't like that client, so I'm just not going to answer that question. And I think that's totally valid. And if you tell people up front that that's your style, then absolutely. In fact, in the past, before humanistic influence on our field, that was more of the approach. That was more common. And there's a lot of value to that. There's a lot of helpfulness to that. And it's fine. I could see that being hurtful to someone who's looking for a different style, right?
I suspect that most therapists haven't articulated for themselves, if they don't want to answer that question, why it is, and come up with a way to talk about it with clients that is not squirrely.
Right.
Or defensive.
Right. So, but I don't know. It could be in the interpretation, right? Like if I saw a therapist kindly and professionally decline to answer that question, and it fit with the whole thing, and their approach seemed ethical to me or helpful.
Sure.
I could see a client walking away feeling really hurt and spinning it in a very negative way, right?
Well, the bad stuff's easier to believe.
Yeah. So I don't know. So that I think is fine. It's totally fine for you, Nadine, to despise that approach. I would despise that approach, and I would never do that approach. But there's that. And so it's just clearly, at least in that element, a bad match between you and the therapist. And so just kind of going back over your email, you're saying, while I respect that psychologists have different modalities, I found myself feeling like I was more of a participant in an experimental study instead of a client and a human being. The thing I'll say to that is there are many therapists that actually actively strive for that style of therapy, not to make you feel like you're a participant in a study, but that you're not there to make friends, that you're there to actually learn skills, to go through a protocol. And that sort of thinking is not the way I talk. If you listen to this podcast, you might think like, what kind of therapist is this? Those therapists are out there. I've been supervised by therapists like that before, and it's unpleasant to me. but they're not unethical. They're not wrong. It's just a very different thing that than what I do. And there's some value to it. Some people might really like that because they cut to the chase, and you get the picture that the therapist is following a procedure instead of it getting really floppy. There's benefits to it. So you asked me, how would I feel? So Bob, how would you feel if you got a letter along these lines that, was rational? Like, I guess given your style, it might be a letter like, hey, I know our last session's coming up, but I feel like even though you say you like me, you just feel distant to me. Like, how would you feel? That's what Nadine is asking.
Oh, nervous. And then I would have my meeting and I would bring the letter and have a talk about it and what's behind it and the pain that the person's in. I'd be interested and curious. You guys, I have a more warm style. I don't believe in this distance thing and the blank slate. I don't believe in that. And I think even if you're doing CBT with somebody, you can have a collegial relationship while you do it. Do you like me? Might be just a way to actually make the work go better. Because don't you work better with coworkers when you have collegiality than when you don't, right? So I don't think it's that big a deal. Yeah, I like you. You're cool.
But what if you don't feel that way? I mean, haven't you ever had a client where you're just like, especially if you were the sort of therapist that didn't really try to engender a feeling of goodwill? Because, you and I, if we had a client that triggered us or pushed our buttons somehow, we would actively seek consultation, supervision, and methods internally, even in between the session, to try to orient ourselves towards empathy and compassion and connection and understanding, such that our natural goodwill and empathy, positive regard would emerge. But if you're having a hard time with that and they ask you in the middle of that, do you say, no, I don't like you? What do you say?
What do you say? Well, I don't know. I'm just spitballing here. I might say, I feel frustrated with you or with this part of our knowing one another. I feel uncomfortable. I might say that. I don't know if I would say, but it might be true that what's happening is something that in the client is triggering me and my trauma history or whatever. And that really is mine to manage. But I think saying such a thing would hopelessly disrupt the possibility of a therapeutic relationship. So it's a curveball. It's hard to know what to do because we strive for authenticity. At the same time, we don't want to hurt anybody, especially not over something like that, like over a difficulty I have with managing my own countertransference. That would be a crappy reason for somebody that'd be a crappy reason to cause that kind of disruption. But I do get triggered. That's just a fact. And I probably cannot eliminate that from possibility for me.
Yeah.
It's tricky though. Do I own it? Do I say something to the client? Is that going to be helpful?
Depends on the client, right?
It depends on the client. I mean, yeah, it depends on so many things. It's hard to know. Did I ever tell you that story about when I was going to be a nanny?
No.
Oh, yes. When I got out of college, I was working at the psych hospital at the runaway shelter back in Pennsylvania. And somebody, I don't know how they found me, but they were interested in hiring me to live in their house and look after their 10-year-old son because they were a single parent. And part of the job interview was to go meet the kid and hang out. So we met and hung out, and he was really braggadocious. I've got a better this, and I've got a great that, and and it was really kind of. I mean, I was 23. I was green as green could be. I was also in personal counseling with my first therapist, second therapist, really. Anyways, I took it to that therapy, and I asked my therapist about it, talked about it, and she gave me some direct advice. She said, don't you wouldn't tell a child, like, you don't tell them you don't like them. Like, I'm not taking this job because I don't like you. Instead, I like you better when. So then I had 2 meetings with that kid. The second meeting, we went on another bike ride, and we're biking around, blah, blah, blah. And he was doing his braggy thing. And I said, I like you. I enjoy our time more when you're not bragging about, your bike or whatever. And we just get to kind of be together. And I think it put him at ease. And he stopped bragging, and we had a really lovely afternoon. I didn't end up taking that job. I think it's because I didn't want to have another job. I had 2 jobs already, and I didn't want a third. But it wasn't because I couldn't get along with that kid. I actually think he and I would have been pretty good friends. Let's see, the story comes to mind because it was a way to handle my feelings authentically, honestly, but not with some unnecessary bullshit, dumping on the child. Like, he's 10. So I can treat him with candor, but also with kindness. That's a better solution than anything else. I'm kind of rambly here a little bit because
No, that makes sense.
This question makes me uncomfortable because it has happened where I haven't had a good feeling towards my client. And I'm pretty clear that the reasons for that are twofold. One is sometimes clients behave in an obnoxious way and they're hard to take. And another is I can get triggered. It can be difficult to talk to somebody about their behavior that you don't like without attacking them. But that's important and essential. But you got to be pretty sophisticated and awake to do that well. And possible that this therapist is mistuned. Possible that they are actually overwhelmed by whatever's coming up for them, and they've punted on the question.
Yeah, it's possible that the therapist is actually not the way I'm describing, in that they have a sound, well thought out, justified, ethical policy of not answering questions like that. It's possible that the therapist just doesn't know what they're doing and just, I don't know.
Need some help.
Yeah.
Need some guidance. But doesn't perhaps know that they do need guidance.
Right. I can't
We
tell.
don't know that.
Yeah, I can't tell. I suspect it's more the former than the latter, but obviously I can't tell. Yeah, the thing I'll say about how I would feel is similar to Bob. But the other thing I'll say is the last sentence is a little much. Because the first
What was
bit,
the last sentence?
so the whole letter, and I didn't read the whole thing, was fine. And like Bob said, it's like it's professional. It's not personal.
Yeah.
It's kind of personal, but for us therapists, we're supposed to process our feelings and then approach it from like, okay, what is this person trying to tell me?
Right.
And how can I be professional and helpful?
Yeah.
But the last sentence is a little much. You say, I hope you are able to process this with your supervisor, as I understand that so this assumption that somehow this clinician needs to process this with their supervisor there's a lot of assumption there. The therapist could say, well, one, I don't have a supervisor because I'm more experienced in that. And two, I don't need to consult because I know what I'm doing about this. It's like when you're at a store and you have a customer that doesn't like what's happening and you're like, can I talk to your manager?
Yeah.
And the manager comes over and is like, what? My employee is doing what they're supposed to do. And customer, you can complain if you want, but I'm not going to swoop in and fight for you or something. I don't agree with you or whatever. So
it reads aggressive and angry.
Just assume that a letter like this, if the clinician needs to consult, then they will. You don't have to prompt them to do that. It'd be like saying, I hope that you go to therapy and realize that you have issues that are resulting in your coldness. It's just like, okay, like just state how you feel, which is great, and state, what's going on for you and how you experienced it and what you were wanting your therapist to do. But, I would steer away from sentences like that. Having said that, if a client said that to me, it wouldn't bother me really. I would just...
well, how would you read it?
it would hurt my feelings, the last sentence in particular. But
but how would you read it? How would you see the other person's feeling or attitude.
Well, the same way as
sentence.
you. Same way as you. I
okay.
mean, I would.
Yeah.
I was. All right. Well, let's take another break.
Right on.
All right, we're back from the break. Let's do an OPP, Old Patron Praise, for those patrons who became patrons all the way back in May of 2020. We have Cyan and Taylor and Rachel and Catherine and Kendall and Tyler and Emily and Jeannie from God knows where. We have Alex from Laguna Beach, California. Doesn't that sound fancy? Laguna Beach.
Is that near San Diego?
I don't know.
Okay.
Dawn from Sussex, Wisconsin. There's a Sussex, Wisconsin. Stacy from Salt Lake City. Kimmy from Seattle. Isabel from Jersey City, where you're from, Bob, just joking. Andrea from Tucson, Arizona. Hot Tucson. Casey from Austin, Texas, the other Seattle. Lindsay from Seattle. Saracen from Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Oh, like the Oak Ridge Boys, right?
Wow.
Dalton.
Elvira.
Oh, is that the song they sing?
Yeah.
Dalton from Katy, Texas. Azrothiel from New South Wales, Australia. Fiona from Kamloops, British Columbia. Have you been to Kamloops, British Columbia?
I've seen that. Is that near Vancouver?
No. I mean,
How do I know that name?
Well,
is it near Whistler?
It's funny. No, it's more east, Kamloops. It's a tiny little town, but I've been there and it's lovely. I'm looking it up right now.
I can't remember why I know that.
Yeah, it's northeast of Vancouver, pretty far actually. I think Banff is up there.
Yeah.
And we have Jimena from Chula Vista, California. Abhay from Great Britain. Lisa from Maryland, and Nate from Palm Desert, California. Thank you for being patrons and sticking with us ever since. So, Bob.
Yeah.
I just want to say that COVID has come to my family.
Oh, no. What's going on?
So this is kind of a medium long story. Okay, before the pandemic, Stacy's dad wanted to take us all on this little cruise, but it's like a cruise boat that goes up to Alaska, or it starts in Alaska and it starts in Sitka and goes to Juneau, if you're familiar. And it's only like 25 passengers.
Oh, neat.
And like 10 workers or 15 workers on the boat.
Sounds great.
Yeah. And it's a lot of hiking and fishing and kayaking and, just the great outdoors, And so, and it's very expensive. It's like $10,000 a person or something like this.
How long is it?
A week. And they have like fancy food and entertainment stuff. And he's not rich. He's just toward the end of his life and has money in his retirement fund. And he just wanted to bond with everyone. And so
How many of you?
Oh, at the beginning, I don't know, it was maybe like 15 of us or something.
Right on.
And so I was really looking forward to it. Stacy was less enthusiastic because she's phobic of water and tsunamis and stuff. And so she was, she was okay with it, but she had some anxiety about it. So that was way back then, about 3 years ago, when we first had this proposed to us, and then the pandemic hit, and so it was canceled. And then the pandemic continued, and it was canceled again. And so it was rescheduled for this month, which is end of June or early July 2022. And at the last moment, just before we were leaving, we received this email that says that, by the way, there's no internet or cell phone during the trip because you're in the middle of nowhere.
Well, right.
And I don't know why that didn't occur to me or us, but when that email came out, Stacy and I were just like, wait, so, because it's so weird the way our lives are so different now, even after just a couple years, with our careers, with our livelihood. The internet is such a part of it. And the podcast, the YouTube channel, it requires hour by hour monitoring. There's always something that's happening. There's always a crisis. And Stacy and I, it's just us. Like, there's multiple social media platforms. There's 20 episodes a week, if not more. Actually, there's like 25-ish episodes that are published. Some are very short and some are very long.
Really? Every week?
Yeah. There's so much to monitor, and for us to be completely off the grid for 8 days is potentially disastrous. I mean, something could happen.
Yeah.
We could lose our entire business. I mean, not likely, but you want to check in on it or something, right?
Sure.
The other thing that she was worried about is being away from our dogs. You know, we would have a house sitter or someone that would take care of the dogs, but
sure.
But Stacy, when we've done that in the past, a big part of her anxiety being relieved is we have cameras, and so we can sort of check in on the dogs and just see them and be reassured that they're okay. Also, if something goes wrong, being able to talk with the person who's taking care of the dogs, you know, if one of the dogs runs off or throws up or something, you know, Stacy just wants to be able to consult or be a help of some sort.
Right.
And Stacy has a bit of trauma around this because when we were on a vacation one time with our previous dog, Chloe, she would have these really horrible seizures. I don't know if you remember this.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. Like once a month, she would go through like 48 hours of a seizure every 90 minutes.
Oh God, poor pup.
Full on seizures where she's, you know, I don't want to describe it because it's traumatic to me, but
psychogenic, no doubt.
Yeah. And for those who are, you know, going, well, you know, there's medication for that. Yeah, I know. We did everything because the seizures were going on for 5 years.
Right.
Every month. And so we tried all the medications. We tried all the diet restrictions. We looked at, you know, alternative things. We looked at, you know, everything. And it just, sometimes we'd have some success. Anyway, so we're on vacation and these seizures start happening, and Stacy had to kind of help the dog sitter from afar, and it was really rough on her because she one, just felt bad for her dog, but two, felt bad for the person who had to take care of the dog because seizures, you know, there's pee and poop and saliva and blood goes everywhere, not to be graphic, but you know, the dog could die, eventually did die from the seizures, and so, you know, you need to get the dog in the car, take the dog to the vet, you know, what vet do you go to that can take an emergency kind of situation. So Stacy and I were looking at each other going, so what? Completely off the grid for 8 days? And so at the last minute, so then Stacy was thinking about staying home, but this is her family. So I'm like, well, I should stay home. It's your family. Which I was bummed about because I've never been on one. I've never been on a cruise at all. Especially like this. Yeah, right. And I'm like, oh, and I actually have family in Sitka, and I've never been to Sitka. My Japanese side of my family, some of them are in Sitka.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and they've been up there for many, many years, for, I don't know, 40, 50 years or something. So I offered to stay home, and Stacy goes. So then Stacy goes on the cruise, and, you know, we're in the middle of a pretty big Omicron variant wave right now. If you look at the stats, although no one seems to be operating from that fact, there, you know, there's a there's a lot of people getting reinfected, even, you know, people who are vaccinated getting infected. So, but Stacy and I more recently, even though we were very buttoned up during the past 2 years, like more buttoned up than almost anyone I knew, and never got it and never even came close to getting it, we started to relax because we're just like, well, we've heard of our friends getting it and they said it was not great. You know, like Mike and Beth said they had it and they said it was awful, but it wasn't, you know, it was just like getting a bad cold, and they had fever and the shakes, but they were, you know, they could breathe. That's always my worry. It's just like, I don't want to be gasping for oxygen.
Air hunger's the worst.
Yeah. So I can handle a fever. I can handle being achy. I mean, I don't want to. I can handle a cough, but I don't want to feel like my lungs are filling up with phlegm, you know, and I can't breathe. That would terrify me. So, and of course I don't want to die and I don't want to be a vector. But anyway, but we're like, you know, let's relax because, I don't know, it just seems like this is our life now, right? And we can't just hole up in our house all the time.
So she went.
So she went, and she had a great time, and I bring the whole family to the airport and back from the airport. So 2 nights ago, I'm bringing them back from the airport. Also, by the way, someone was messing with my AC or my air system, and I switched it to recirculation air. So this will come into play. Maybe. Who knows?
Well, right.
So at this point, I am unknowingly in a car with 3 people who have COVID.
Damn.
I don't know if I have it. I'm hoping that I don't, because they weren't like coughing yet, and they would have maybe been infected rather recently, and so there's a chance that they weren't shedding the virus at that point.
Right.
But 3, if not 4 people in my car for 45 minutes with recirculation air, all of us breathing the same saliva droplets. 3 of them have COVID. So we come home, and the next day it starts to come out that's that Stacey's brother had it.
No.
He tested positive, and then everyone starts having symptoms. Yeah. That was in her family. Now, I know many of you listening out there are just like, well, yeah, Kirk, I mean, that's the pandemic. I'm guessing most of the people listening right now had COVID at some point or lived with someone who did and had to quarantine and all that stuff. But Stacey and I have managed to avoid this for 2.5 years. And
you're a co-virgin.
Yeah. And to now, at this point, right now, we're both vaccinated. I've had 4 shots. She's had 3 of Pfizer. And so maybe that protects me a little bit more and hopefully mitigates the symptoms. If you're vaccinated, research shows that it does, and makes sense that it would. But we've had friends who were fully vaccinated and had massive symptoms, and of course there are cases where people die even though they're fully vaccinated. So I don't know. It's so Stacey and I are quarantining in separate parts of the house. Yeah. And I don't know how to feel about it, because on one level I'm like, well, let's be optimistic. Maybe she won't get symptoms, and then in a week we can start hanging out again. And maybe I never was infected. Maybe everyone will just get a little bit of symptoms and this will all be fine. Yeah. On the other hand, it's like, this could be horrific. And even the average symptoms can last for a month or 2, I hear, for people, where it takes them a long time to fully recover. Young, healthy people, it takes them a long time.
Makes the brain go a little crazy, don't it? All the possibilities. And it's always, we imagine the worst.
Yeah. And my parents-in-law, father, he tested positive. So, and he's like 85 or older than that. Yeah.
Right.
And his health isn't fantastic, which I can't imagine a lot of people at that age it is. Right. It's terrifying. Right. Yeah. Right. And I felt like I needed to tell. Stacey and I have been talking about it all, the past 24 hours, and I haven't talked about it with anyone else. Right. And you were supposed to come over today.
Yeah,
and so I was like, you can't come over, so we either have to reschedule or we can do it over the internet. And so,
you guys need anything?
No, I mean, she's fine. We've opened up all the windows.
Sure.
She wears her mask when she leaves her office.
It's probably going to be okay, but I get it. I would feel the same way, really nervous and, Yeah. And you're doing what you can. You're being as careful as a person could be. Yeah. And your chances are good as a result that you'll be okay, and it's probably going to be mild if anything. She's probably most likely going to be fine, but, it still sucks.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you're going to get in touch with me if you need anything.
Yeah, but I'm not sick. And I don't know. I would give it I don't know. It's just, so on one hand, I'm sitting in a car with 3 to 4 infected people. Yeah. For 45 minutes. Right. In a very enclosed space.
It's like that scene from Outbreak, right?
Yeah. What's the chance that I don't have it? I
don't know.
I mean, I've had 4 shots, so there's that. Also, they might not have been shedding the virus at that point.
Right. Nobody was symptomatic.
Yeah. So, there's that. But on the other hand, it's like, well, how can you not get it if you're stuck in a car for 45 minutes with people that would test positive the next day, right? Mm-hmm. Well, what percentage chance would you think based on the description?
15%. That'd be my
really?
guess. Yeah.
Why so? Because to me, I'm like 50%. I'm going to get sick. But why would you say 15?
I don't know. It's not based on any data. I'm just guessing. It's probably going to be okay. You're probably
Yeah.
not going to get sick.
Yeah.
Because she's just a little bit sick. She wasn't sick when you were there, blah, blah, blah. I think you're probably going to 15%.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
1.5 chances in 10.
Yeah.
That's 8.5 chances in 10 that you will not get sick.
Yeah. Well, you keep stating the percentage in different ways without any kind of justification, which I have to say.
Zero justification. 0.0% justification for any of my opinion, as usual.
And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because
You deserve it.